Moon Palace, Chapter 7. Rain poured heavily when Mei Ling and Wei Long arrived at Moon Palace. She parked the car near the back door and popped the trunk. Jose saw them behind the screen and came out immediately. He and Wei Long bought in the produce then. Mei Ling proceeded to park the car in the back of the building. She got out of the car and ran inside and rushed into her office. She cursed herself for not carrying an umbrella. Her blouse was so wet that her bra was showing. She hoped no one noticed it when she walked in. She reached into her drawer, took out a roll of paper towel, and dried herself. Chills began to crawl along her back, but luckily she has a cardigan hung over the back of her chair. She put it on and noticed that it did not fit the color she was wearing, but it did not matter at this point. When she stepped out of the office, Wei Long handed her a towel. She paused for a second and thanked him and wondered if he saw her before she hid herself. Just then, her cheeks were flushed. The business was usually slow on a rainy day at Moon Palace, and today was no exception. Shu Ming and Peng sat at a table nearby the waitress station, peeling pea pods, while Mei Ling wiped the dust off the counter and the register. There was no one dining in during lunchtime, only a few phone calls for takeout orders. Whenever this occurred, Yuan would panic, take off, and not return until a few hours later. There were other phone calls besides the takeout orders. There were calls from service companies who wanted to know if they needed any kitchen equipment checked. "Have them come over to change the grease filters," said Lao Tang. The rain continued to pour throughout the day, along with occasional unsettling thunder and lightning. But that was not as disturbing as what the weather was about to do later in the evening. It was around 7:30 at night, where there were only a few customers dining in. Peng and Shu Ming were taking care of them when they heard dribble sounds on one of the tables in the middle of the room. They looked up and saw water coming from the ceiling. Peng immediately went to the back and grabbed a bucket and placed it underneath the leak. They heard more drip elsewhere. Shu Ming spotted and pointed. "It's leaking over there too." Out of panic, Peng snapped at Shu Ming. "Don't just stand there, go get a bucket." Shu Ming looked around the waitress station and then the closet and shouted, "I can't find one." Peng snorted and shouted back, "Then go get a pot in the kitchen." Wei Long and Jose overheard their shouting, came out of the kitchen to help. Lao Tang heard them too, but he pretended not to notice and continued reading his newspapers. Meanwhile, Mei Ling called the landlord, but no one answered. She tried several times, but the result was the same. She finally left a message over the phone and joined the rescue. Some of the customers saw the commotion and left without ordering their food, and the rest of the customers left after settling their bills. About 20 minutes into the ordeal, where they rushed back and forth to catch and dump the water, Wei Long disappeared. Mei Ling wondered where he went. She needed everybody to get this taken care of. She went into the kitchen, saw Lao Tang reading the paper, and sneered at him. When she looked in her office in the back room, Lao Tang said nonchalantly, "He's outside." Mei Ling stepped into the alley and saw a ladder a few feet away from leaning against the back wall. He must be up there, she thought. The ladder was normally placed somewhere in the back room. She looked up to the top of the building and contemplated. She never climbed up the roof before, and never even used a ladder before, especially with high heels on. But if he was willing to go up there to save the roof, she should help. She took a deep breath and let out her nervousness. And while her body was trembling, she climbed her first step. In the midst of the stormy weather, Mei-ling climbed up and over the roof. As soon as she was near the edge of the rooftop, she noticed Wei Lang putting down a tarp while the wind kept lifting it away from him. Mei-ling looked around and saw some loose concrete blocks at a corner. She pointed to them and shouted, "There, use those to hold the tarp down." Mei-ling grabbed the tarp while Wei Lang went to the corner. As he was just about to put a block over the tarp, it suddenly skid from him. Then a sudden blast of wind lifted the tarp up and out of Mei-ling's grip. The tarp flew across the roof towards the opposite side of the building. She went after it as fast as she could, but slipped over some loose gravels and landed on her knees. Wei Lang ran to her and lifted her up. "Are you all right?" Awkwardly, she replied, "Yes," and immediately pointed at the tarp. "It's going to fly off the roof." "I'll get it." Wei Lang ran after it, which by now was dangling halfway over the edge. He dragged it back to the leaking area where Mei-ling helped him spread it out. She then stood in the middle of the tarp while he lifted the blocks one by one and placed them along the edge. How ironic, she thought, that she never had this kind of problem until her husband was gone. And this stranger, whom she never met until 3 days ago, just decided to climb up to save the roof. He did not have to do it. No one asked him to do it. It is not part of his job, and yet he did it. Why did he do it? Why was he willing to make such sacrifice, getting drenched in the rain like this and taking a risk of possibly getting struck by lightning? However, she was glad that he did. He was focused and unaffected by nature's moment of threats, while moving swiftly and rhythmically until he pinned down the tarp. Just then she let out a sigh of relief. The wind and the rain slowed down gradually, as if the gods were impressed with Wei Lang and Mei-ling's act of bravery and gave up their game of terror. The storm was dispersed, and the roaring thunder drifted into the distant sky, along with some occasional flashes behind the silver lining. Mei-ling and Wei Lang stood in silence, forgetting how soaked they were, forgetting that there were still some people underneath running around like mad. Wei Lang lifted up his head. His eyes gazed at Mei-ling and strode slowly towards her. He placed his hands on the edge of her shoulders and looked at her intensely through his wet and disarrayed hair. He was studying her like an artist studying his subject. His unapologetic deep, dark eyes absorbing her face, her eyes, her nose, and her lips, then back to her eyes again. But this time he pierced into them, as if he was entering her mind and implanting his thoughts deep into hers. And what thoughts would that be other than how glad that the leak was covered, and that they were the ones who took care of it, especially him? But those were probably not his thoughts, not the way he looked at her, the way he held her shoulders, and the way his face was so close to hers. No, there were much more than that he wanted from her, more than a thank you, more than a cash bonus, and especially more than something that she could not possibly give. Not now, not ever. She was indignant. His silent stare began to aggravate her. Suddenly, her view of his heroic act was saturated by her confusion of his sudden closeness. She stepped back, and his hands fell towards his body. She turned around with his back facing him, something she was good at, turning away, looking away. And if it wasn't not for these high heels, she could have been running away. The trance was dispelled, and the message was broken. He closed his eyes and pursed his lips. His hands, the only physical part of him that touched her, were now hidden inside his jean pockets. Waylon turned, walked towards the ladder, and sank into the edge of the roof. Upon hearing his steps grinding across the gravel roof, Mei-Ling looked into the distance and pondered what just happened. One moment they were saving a catastrophe, and the next moment they were standing close to each other as if there were some sort of force generated by lightning and transformed into some sort of cognitive connection, linking them. And even though that connection was invisible and silent, it seemed to have penetrated and imprinted it in her mind, and possibly in her heart.